Hello, third graders. So, when we left off at the end of chapter 25, we learned a little bit more about Catherine Barlow and how she was a school teacher in the town of Green Lake years and years and years ago, and that she had just kissed Sam, who was a black man, and somebody saw them. Hattie Parker saw them. She stepped out of the general store and she told them that God will punish them. And I had mentioned why that was the case and how back then blacks and whites were not supposed to be in a relationship together, and that it was illegal for them to get married. And so that gives you a little bit more understanding as to why there was that reaction. So, chapter 26. There were no telephones, but word spread quickly through the small town. By the end of the day, everyone in Green Lake had heard that the school teacher had kissed the onion picker. Not one child showed up for school the next morning. Miss Catherine sat alone in the classroom and wondered if she had lost track of the day of the week. Perhaps it was Saturday. It wouldn't have surprised her. Her brain and heart had been spinning ever since Sam kissed her. She heard a noise outside the door, and suddenly a mob of men and women came storming into the school building. They were led by Trout Walker. "There she is," Trout shouted, "the devil woman." The mob was turning over desks and ripping down bulletin boards. "She's been poisoning your children's brains with books," Trout declared. They began piling all the books in the center of the room. "Think about what you are doing," cried Miss Catherine. Someone made a grab for her, tearing her dress, but she managed to get out of the building. She ran to the sheriff's office. The sheriff had his feet up on the desk and was drinking from a bottle of whiskey. "Morning, Miss Catherine," he said. They're destroying the schoolhouse," she said, gasping for breath. "They'll burn it to the ground if someone doesn't stop them." "Just calm your pretty self down a second," the sheriff said in a slow drawl, "and tell me what you're talking about." He got up from his desk and walked over to her. "Trout Walker has—" "Now don't go saying nothing bad about Charles Walker," said the sheriff. "We don't have much time," urged Catherine. "You've got to stop them." "You're sure pretty," said the sheriff. Miss Catherine stared at him in horror. "Kiss me," said the sheriff. She slapped him across the face. He laughed. "You kissed the onion picker. Why won't you kiss me?" She tried to slap him again, but he caught her by the hand. She tried to wriggle free. "You're drunk," she yelled. "I always get drunk before a hanging." "A hanging? Who?" "It's against the law for a Negro to kiss a white woman." "Well, then you'll have to hang me too," said Catherine, "because I kissed him back." It ain't against the law for you to kiss him," the sheriff explained. "Just for him to kiss you." "We're all equal under the eyes of God," she declared. The sheriff laughed. "Then if Sam and I are equal, why won't you kiss me?" He laughed again. "I'll make you a deal. One sweet kiss and I won't hang your boyfriend. I'll just run him out of town." Miss Catherine jerked her hand free. As she hurried to the door, she heard the sheriff say, "The law will punish Sam, and God will punish you." She stepped back into the street and saw smoke rising from the schoolhouse. She ran down to the lakefront where Sam was hitching Mary Lou to the onion cart. "Thank God I found you," she sighed, hugging him. "We've got to get out of here now." "What?" "Someone must have seen us kissing yesterday," she said. "They set fire to the schoolhouse. The sheriff said he's going to hang you." Sam hesitated for a moment as if he couldn't quite believe it. He didn't want to believe it. "Come on, Mary Lou." "We have to leave Mary Lou behind," said Catherine. Sam stared at her for a moment. There were tears in his eyes. "Okay." Sam's boat was in the water, tied to a tree by a long rope. He untied it, and they waded through the water and climbed aboard. His powerful arms rowed them away from the shore. But his powerful arms were no match for Trout Walker's motorized boat. They were little more than halfway across the lake when Miss Catherine heard the loud roar of the engine. Then she saw the ugly black smoke. These are the facts. The Walker boat smashed into Sam's boat. Sam was shot and killed in the water. Catherine Barlow was rescued against her wishes. When they returned to the shore, she saw Mary Lou's body lying on the ground. The donkey had been shot in the head. That all happened 110 years ago. Since then, not one drop of rain has fallen on Green Lake. You make the decision. Whom did God punish? 3 days after Sam's death, Miss Catherine shot the sheriff while he was sitting in his chair drinking a cup of coffee. Then she carefully applied a fresh coat of red lipstick and gave him the kiss he had asked for. For the next 20 years, Kissin' Kate Barlow was one of the most feared outlaws in all the West. Whew, that was intense. So I want to review what happened for anyone who may be a little bit confused. So like I said, back then, it was illegal for blacks and whites to get married or even to date. And so all of the people in Green Lake were just in an uproar over this kiss that had happened between Kate and Sam. And they were in such an uproar that they wanted to kill him over it and burn down the schoolhouse. You might be thinking this is ridiculous and crazy, but unfortunately, this is what happened a lot of times in the past. Even though this exact story isn't true, things like this did happen in the past, unfortunately. So, Kate Barlow, she didn't want to be part of that. She obviously didn't agree with these laws, and she didn't want Sam to be hurt or for any of these bad things to happen. But when she went to the sheriff, he didn't care. And in fact, he was basically trying to get her to kiss him. And she was like, no, leave me alone. I don't want to do that. And so, unfortunately, they tried to escape because she realized the sheriff isn't going to do anything to help us. So we're going to have to do this on our own. And so her and Sam tried to escape, but Trout Walker got to them and unfortunately killed Sam and his donkey. And so Kate Barlow was just absolutely disgusted by this, by what happened, and angry. And so she shot the sheriff, probably because she was really mad at him because he did nothing to try to help them when all of these people came and attacked them. And so she was angry. And so she, and as you know, she then kissed him after she killed him. So it was almost like she was doing it to make a statement. Like, you want to kiss? Fine, I'll kiss you after I kill you. And so people were like, ooh, I'm not going to mess with her. She really is dangerous. She will get revenge if she's angry, and we're going to watch out for her, which is why they considered her a feared outlaw. So you could see that Kate Barlow, she bucked the trend. She was willing to stand up for what she believed in, and she did not let these laws that she thought were unjust stop her from doing what she thought was right. So she was definitely a feared outlaw. Okay, so chapter 27. Stanley dug his shovel into the ground. So now we're back in present day with Stanley. So we're learning more and more about the people that were in Stanley's life, the men that were in Stanley's life in the past, his great-grandfather, his great-great-grandfather. So at some point, we'll probably figure out how Stanley's great-grandfather gets connected with Kate Barlow. Because right now, we're not quite sure how they're connected. We're just learning a little bit more about Kate Barlow's life. And once his great-grandfather gets connected with her, we'll probably get to know more. And we'll know more about why she is the way that she is. So now we're back in present day, and we're learning more about Stanley. Stanley dug his shovel into the ground. His hole was about 3.5 feet deep in the center. He grunted as he pried up some dirt, then flung it off to the side. The sun was almost directly overhead. He glanced at his canteen lying beside his hole. He knew it was half full, but he didn't take a drink just yet. He had to drink sparingly because he didn't know who would be driving the water truck the next time it came. Sparingly means very, very little. So he had to only drink a tiny bit at a time because remember, if Mr. Sir was the one that was coming around with the water, he was not going to give any to Stanley because he was still so angry with him. 3 days had passed since the warden had scratched Mr. Sir. Every time Mr. Sir delivered water, he poured Stanley's straight onto the ground. Fortunately, Mr. Pendanski delivered the water more often than Mr. Sir. Mr. Pendanski was obviously aware of what Mr. Sir was doing because he always gave Stanley a little extra. He'd fill Stanley's canteen, then let Stanley take a long drink, then top it off for him. It helped, too, that Zero was digging some of Stanley's hole for him. Although, as Stanley had expected, the other boys didn't like to see Stanley sitting around while they were working. They say things like, "Who died and made you king?" Or, "It must be nice to have your own personal slave." When he tried pointing out that he was the one who took the blame for the sunflower seeds, the other boys said it was his fault because he was the one who spilled them. "I risked my life for those seeds," Magnet had said, "and all I got was one lousy handful." Stanley had also tried to explain that he needed to save his energy so he could teach Zero how to read, but the other boys just mocked him. "Same old story, ain't it, Armpit?" X-Ray had said. "The white boy sits around while the black boy does all the work. Ain't that right, Caveman?" "No, that's not right," Stanley replied. "No, it ain't," X-Ray agreed. "It ain't right at all." Stanley dug out another shovelful of dirt. He knew X-Ray wouldn't have been talking like that if he was the one teaching Zero to read. Then X-Ray would be talking about how important it was that he got his rest, right? So he could be a better teacher, right? And that was true. He did need to save his strength so he could be a better teacher, although Zero was a quick learner. Sometimes, in fact, Stanley hoped the warden was watching them, with her secret cameras and microphones, so she'd know that Zero wasn't as stupid as everyone thought. From across the lake, he could see the approaching dust cloud. He took a drink from his canteen, then waited to see who was driving the truck. The swelling on Mr. Sir's face had gone down, but it was still a little puffy. There had been 3 scratch marks down his cheek. 2 of the marks had faded, but the middle scratch must have been the deepest because it still remained. It was a jagged purple line running from below his eye to below his mouth, like a tattoo of a scar. Stanley waited in line, then handed him his canteen. Mr. Sir held it up to his ear and shook it. He smiled at the swishing sound. Stanley hoped he wouldn't dump it out. To his surprise, Mr. Sir held the canteen under the stream of water and filled it. "Wait here," he said. Still holding Stanley's canteen, Mr. Sir walked past him, then went around the side of the truck and into the cab where he wouldn't be seen. "What's he doing in there?" asked Zero. "I wish I knew," said Stanley. A short while later, Mr. Sir came out of the truck and handed Stanley his canteen. It was still full. "Thank you, Mr. Sir." Mr. Sir smiled at him. "What are you waiting for?" he asked. "Drink up." He popped some sunflower seeds into his mouth, chewed, and spit out the shells. Stanley was afraid to drink it. He hated to think what kind of vile substance Mr. Sir might have put in it. Vile is like disgusting. So clearly he put something in it that he didn't want Stanley to see because he went around his truck to fill it up and then he came back. I wouldn't drink it. He brought the canteen back to his hole. For a long time he left it beside his hole as he continued to dig. Then, when he was so thirsty that he could hardly stand it anymore, he unscrewed the cap, turned the canteen over, and poured it all out onto the dirt. He was afraid that if he'd waited another second, he might have taken a drink. So clearly he knows that he couldn't take a chance and actually drink whatever it was that was in there, because it's entirely possible that Mr. Sir put poison in it, and it could have hurt him or killed him. So he knew that he was so thirsty that if he let himself hold on to the water or whatever it was that was in there, he might have been tempted to want to drink it anyways, even despite the fact that he was worried that it might have contained poison. After Stanley taught Zero the final 6 letters of the alphabet, he taught him to write his name. Capital Z-E-R-O. Zero wrote the letters as Stanley said them. "Zero," he said, looking at his piece of paper. His smile was too big for his face. Stanley watched him write it over and over again. 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. In a way, it made him sad. He couldn't help but think that 100 times 0 was still nothing. "You know, that's not my real name," Zero said as they headed back to the rec room for dinner. "Well, yeah," Stanley said. "I guess I knew that." He had never really been sure. "Everyone's always called me Zero, even before I came here." "Oh, okay. My real name's Hector." "Hector," Stanley repeated. "Hector Zeroni." Hector Zeroni. Where have we heard the last name Zeroni before? Do you remember? I'll give you a hint. Remember Stanley's great-great-grandfather, Elia Yelnats? Remember who he went to? Remember he went to that Egyptian, she was like a fortune teller lady, Madame Zeroni. And remember he put a curse on Elia and all of his descendants because he didn't carry her up the mountain. And this little boy that Stanley is at Camp Green Lake with is Hector Zeroni. Might he be a descendant of Madame Zeroni? Interesting. Okay, we're going to read chapter 28 and then we're going to stop. It's not very long. After 20 years, Kate Barlow returned to Green Lake. So now we're going back to the past again. I know that there's a little bit of confusion here as we keep jumping to the present day with Stanley and then back to the past where we're learning about his ancestors, his great-grandfather and his great-great-grandfather. It was a place where nobody would ever find her, a ghost town on a ghost lake. The peach trees had all died, but there were a couple of small oak trees still growing by an old abandoned cabin. The cabin used to be on the eastern shore of the lake. Now the edge of the lake was over 5 miles away, and it was little more than a small pond full of dirty water. So remember, she ran off after she killed the sheriff, and she probably felt like she had to stay away and never return again to anyone who knew her because they might try to kill her after what she did. So now by the time she comes back to Green Lake, it's a ghost town. So nobody lives there anymore. 20 years after what she did, nobody lives in Green Lake. She lived in the cabin. Sometimes she could hear Sam's voice echoing across the emptiness. Onions, sweet fresh onions. She knew she was crazy. She knew she'd been crazy for the last 20 years. Oh, Sam, she would say, speaking into the vast emptiness. I know it is hot, but I feel so very cold. My hands are cold. My feet are cold. My face is cold. My heart is cold. And sometimes she would hear him say, I can fix that. And she'd feel his warm arm across her shoulders. She had been living in the cabin about 3 months when she was awakened one morning by someone kicking open the cabin door. She opened her eyes to see the blurry end of a rifle 2 inches from her nose. She could smell Trout Walker's dirty feet. You've got exactly 10 seconds to tell me where you've hidden your loot, said Trout, or else I'll blow your head off. She yawned. A red-headed woman was there with Trout. Kate could see her rummaging through the cabin, dumping drawers and knocking things from the shelves of cabinets. The woman came to her. Where is it? She demanded. Linda Miller? Asked Kate. Is that you? Linda Miller had been in the 4th grade when Kate Barlow was still a teacher. She'd been a cute, freckled-faced girl with beautiful red hair. Now her face was blotchy and her hair was dirty and scraggly. It's Linda Walker now, said Trout. Oh, Linda, I'm so sorry, said Kate. Trout jabbed her throat with the rifle. Where's the loot? There is no loot, said Kate. Loot is like money or expensive belongings, things that you would want if you were robbing someone. Don't give me that, shouted Trout. You've robbed every bank from here to Houston. You better tell him, said Linda. We're desperate. You married him for his money, didn't you? Asked Kate. Linda nodded. But it's all gone. It dried up with the lake. The peach trees, the livestock. I kept thinking it has to rain soon. The drought can't last forever, but it just kept getting hotter and hotter and hotter. Her eyes fixed on the shovel, which was leaning up against the fireplace. She's buried it, she declared. I don't know what you're talking about, said Kate. There was a loud blast as Trout fired his rifle just above her head. The window behind her shattered. Where's it buried? He demanded. Go ahead and kill me, Trout, said Kate, but I sure hope you like to dig, because you're going to be digging for a long time. It's a big, vast wasteland out there. You and your children and their children can dig for the next 100 years, and you'll never find it. Linda grabbed Kate's hair and jerked her head back. Oh, we're not going to kill you, she said, but by the time we're finished with you, you're going to wish you were dead. I've been wishing I was dead for the last 20 years, said Kate. They dragged her out of bed and pushed her outside. She wore blue silk pajamas. Her turquoise-studded black boots remained beside her bed. They loosely tied her legs together so she could walk, but she couldn't run. They made her walk barefoot on the hot ground. They wouldn't let her stop walking. Not until you take us to the loot, said Trout. Linda hit Kate on the back of her legs with the shovel. You're going to take us to it sooner or later, so you might as well make it sooner. She walked one way, then the other, until her feet were black and blistered. Whenever she stopped, Linda whacked her with the shovel. I'm losing my patience, warned Trout. She felt the shovel jab into her back, and she fell hard onto the dirt. Get up, ordered Linda. Kate struggled to her feet. We're being easy on you today, said Trout. It's just going to keep getting worse and worse for you until you take us to it. Look out, shouted Linda. A lizard leaped toward them. Kate could see its big red eyes. Linda tried to hit it with a shovel, and Trout shot at it, but they both missed. The lizard landed on Kate's bare ankle. Its sharp black teeth bit into her leg. Its white tongue lapped up the droplets of blood that leaked out of the wound. Kate smiled. There was nothing they could do to her anymore. Start digging, she said. Where is it? Linda screeched. Where did you bury it? Trout demanded. Kate Barlow died laughing. So what kind of lizard attacked Kate and killed her? Remember? A yellow spotted lizard. Now, you might wonder, well, why did she laugh? She knew she was dying. But remember, she said she had been wishing that she was dead for the past 20 years because her life had probably been pretty miserable. And she kind of probably felt like she didn't really have much life left in her. And she clearly thinks it's funny that Trout and Linda are so sure that she's rich and has all this money somewhere because they seem to think that she's robbed a bunch of banks. But I think that we can infer that she really doesn't have any money and that she really doesn't have anything of value. But they're so sure that she's been burying all of these expensive treasures and expensive, maybe money that she's been burying. And so they are clearly going to start digging all over, digging holes because they're going to look for all of this loot that they think that she has. Because remember, they said, hold on. You've robbed every bank from here to Houston. So he seems to think that she's robbed a bunch of banks and that she has all this money. So now things are coming together, okay? So remember, Kate is back at Green Lake. It's now a vast wasteland. She was killed at Green Lake, where Trout Walker and his wife Linda are so sure that she's got all kinds of money buried here. And so he's going to start digging around looking for it. So it makes me wonder if somehow Trout Walker is going to make other people believe that there is treasure and money buried here at Camp Green Lake. And that's going to bring us to the present day where they've got these kids that they're keeping prisoner to dig holes all over the place to search for this buried money that they seem to think exists that really doesn't exist. And when we pick back up, we're going to be at part 2, the last hole. So the first half of the book was part 1, and it was called You Are Entering Camp Green Lake, and that was the first half. And now we're going to be at part 2, the last hole. We'll see. It's getting good.